So here we are, the third day, and 2 days of the holiday of Sukkot, and now Shabbat, essentially a 3-day holiday. And I've challenged myself to try to think of something interesting to say. You can leave your vote, please, outside the door. Actually, the first day I spoke about some of the intertension with the Arba Minim, with the 4 species, the lulav, the etrog, the hadas, the myrtle, and the willow. And yesterday I spoke about the idea of impermanence in our homes, the idea, the sukkah, what it's meant to represent to us, both on an actual physical plane and hopefully on an existential plane, the tensions that are there. Today, this morning, I want to bring them all together. And the idea that I want to bring together with you is actually the tension, the paradox that is found in and of itself in this holiday. And I suspect that you have realized it on some level, but like a lot of things in life, we just kind of accept some tensions and we don't really poke the balloon to see if it pops and what it shows. But we're going to poke the balloon this morning. The holiday of Sukkot, as we said earlier, has 2 dimensions to it. One is an historical dimension. The second is what we would call a religious dimension. The religious dimension of it, or the agricultural dimension of it, is represented by those 4 species: lulav, etrog, the willow, the myrtle. The historical religious story is the story that the sukkah is looking to teach us. And if I was to poll most people, assuming they're knowing of such things, if I was to poll most people and ask them, why do we sit in a sukkah? What would the answer be? For those listening on the podcast, there's a pause now, and I'm turning my microphone out to the crowd. Okay, that's the answer, which is the great theological trick of all time, because God said so. Or as when I was a kid growing up, Gescheit geschrieben, that's the way it's written. But there's an explanation actually provided in the Torah. What's the reason why we sit in the sukkah? Right, thank you. Because God says that he helped us wander in the desert, and that's the reason why we go in Sukkot. And what? What's with the partying with you? This is the 2nd day in a row. Give this man some attention, please. He needs... The idea of the reason why we go into the sukkah is because that is how and why God helped the Jews wander the desert is subject to a lot of criticism. A lot of criticism. First of all, the ancient rabbis of the Talmud did not believe that was the case. And the truth of the matter is, if you were wandering in the desert, would you be schlepping and carrying panels of wood? If you've been to a desert area, how do the Bedouin live? What do they live in? Tents. Why do they live in tents? Because tents are things you can roll up and easily carry along with you. If you're carrying wood panels, not so easy. Not so easy. The ancient rabbis said, poking this balloon a little bit more, they of course offered a theological idea to it. They said that the Jews didn't really live in the kind of Sukkot that we're commanded to build on Sukkah. The Sukkot that they lived in was expressed in Hebrew, the ananei kavod, that these divine clouds surrounded them as they wandered the desert, that the clouds were what they walked on, it provided the walls around them, it actually covered them. In other words, God carried them, protected them, nurtured them through the desert. Even more so, what did the Israelites sustain themselves on when they wandered the desert for the 40 years? Manna from heaven. Correct. So that God essentially gave them room and board when they wandered the desert for those 40 years. Which is nothing like what the sukkah is actually represented to be. Practically speaking, where does the sukkah that we observe come from? They're called harvest huts. And what's a harvest hut? A harvest hut are the huts that people build by their fields. That when it's time for the great harvest, they sleep and live at the fields. So they built small huts with thatch thrown on top. And they lived in these huts in order for them to have quick access at sunrise to get out to the fields, and for the workers too, and they would retire to them at night at sunset. The tension of this idea between what the ancient rabbis were saying, oh no, these Sukkot that we live in are not the kinds of Sukkot that the Israelites were wandering in, and the reality of what we understand is that Sukkot is tied to the harvest festival. Actually, when you go a little bit deeper and you stare inside this popped balloon, you realize that it represents a question that we struggle with as Jews to this very day. You see it playing out in Israel and politics. You see it here in North America and elsewhere throughout the Jewish world. You see this tension as well. And that is, what is the most ideal way that you think God in Judaism expects you to live? There are those who argue and say that the most ideal and supreme way for Jews to live is to return to that primordial moment when we were wandering in the desert, where we walked on divine clouds, were surrounded by clouds of divine walls and a divine roof, and manna fell from heaven. In other words, it is a story of a deep disconnect from the physical and practical realities of the world. I probably don't need to go a step further to explain and describe the kinds of Jews who believe that to be true. But it is characterized by people who eschew secular education and knowledge, who eschew finding themselves employment and building businesses. It is people who rely on the largesse of what they consider to be God's kindness, but it's the largesse of people in the world to support them. And then, of course, there's the other side of the argument that is most profoundly expressed in our generation and time by the great thinkers of the Zionist movement. You think the early Zionists, you think all they did were interested in changing who lived in what was then Ottoman Palestine and then British Palestine? That's not what they were looking to do. They were not simply looking to change where Jews lived. They were looking to change Jews. And when you make your way through most of the major cities and towns in Israel, most famously, of course, in Tel Aviv, but in other places, there is always a street called Gordon. Who's it named after? The great early Zionist thinker, A.D. Gordon, Aleph Dalet Gordon. What did Gordon say? Gordon said that the path to holiness in this world is to work the earth. Gordon himself did this, and he did not come from a farming background in Russia, I assure you. He had been a teacher. And in his old broken age, he made his way to Israel and he worked the earth with his broken back and broken knees and broken hands. But more importantly, he inspired generations, legions of younger Jews to do the same. The early Zionists were not simply interested in changing where the Jews lived, they were interested in changing Jews. The idea that we can live in two worlds. We can live in a world of God and spirituality and not feel that we have to divorce ourselves from the practical realities of the world. The holiday of Sukkot, I believe, is the argument because it is the great harvest. And harvests only occur if you plant seeds and then you sprinkle water on it, and then maybe you need a little fertilizer, and then if bugs come over the growing season, you have to spread things around to get rid of the bugs, and then you have to watch out for birds coming and other animals to eat the crops. In other words, to be a farmer, what must you be? Someone who is intimately, profoundly involved in the daily task of nurturing life in this world. You cannot turn your back away for a moment. The tension of these questions, of these two values of Sukkot that I place before you, are alive and well in the Jewish world today. And I'm not going to come decisively, although I suspect you know what side of the coin I fall on, what kind of Sukkot I imagine our lives should be. But I'm going to conclude with this beautiful story that I heard years ago, personally firsthand, by the sadly now deceased but wonderful Israeli writer, Amos Oz. Amos Oz won a Pras Yisrael, an Israel Prize, for his remarkable writing. One of his most well-known books were made into a movie called A Tale of Love and Darkness with Natalie Portman. It is a story, a painful story of his childhood. His mother was a survivor, and it's heart-wrenching. He was having a discussion, a debate with an ultra-Orthodox man. And then finally, Amos Oz turns to the ultra-Orthodox man, and he says to him, you know, and Amos Oz was Gezeh Chiloni, he was a secular Jew. He says to the ultra-Orthodox Jew, he goes, you know, I'm more Shomer Shabbat than you are. And the guy says, what are you talking about? he says, do you know what I do on Shabbat? I do this, I do that, I do all my shopping. I cut my toilet paper into little pieces. I do everything. And Amos Oz turns to him and says, I'm more Shomer Shabbat than you because for 6 days of the week, I work and create, but on the seventh day, I cease from work and rest. In order to observe Shabbat, Amos Oz told him, you must work for 6 days. Which is the argument, I think, told over and over again, that you don't have to choose between living in the kingdom of God or living in this world. Judaism says you can do both. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach, everyone.